Gutekunst just showed up.
Dr. Gutekunst is in.
There he is. Oh my goodness, a suit and tie.
Okay,
No,
good evening.
it's
Good
business.
evening. Actually, maybe we can stick to our protocol of putting ourselves on mute while you know you're not going to have a speaking role. So for now, let's mute except for me. That's okay. So good evening. This is our May 13th, 2020 meeting of the Community Preservation Committee. Preliminary matters are as follows. As you know, I'm Peter Pingator. I'm the chair of the CPC. I'm going to do a roll call to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. I'm going to start now first with the members of the committee, and I'll go in alphabetical order. Paul Alpert.
Here.
Joe Burns.
Here.
Artie Crocker.
Here.
Bob Dermody.
Here.
Laura Dorfman.
Here.
Chris Gersel.
Here.
Rick Zambone.
Here.
Okay. Rick, you may want to turn up your microphone just a little bit. You're a little muffled.
How's that?
Better.
I just speak louder. I don't know how to turn the volume up.
Speaking louder is not a problem for you. I know that.
No.
Okay. Our staff members, Karis Lustig, staff liaison,
Here.
and our recording secretary, Kristen Wright.
Here.
Okay. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Daniel Gutekunst.
I am here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. This open meeting of the Community Preservation Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. During public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will not feature public comment. For this meeting, the Needham Community Preservation Committee is convening by Zoom app as posted on our town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and that take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Now, with respect to the committee, I believe all supporting materials have been provided to the members, and they are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless I, as chair, note otherwise. Now, we're going to turn to the first item on our agenda, but before we do so, let me cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business. I'll introduce each speaker on the agenda, and after he or she concludes his or her remarks, I will go down the line of members and invite each of you to provide comment or questions or motions. But I think with respect to Dr. Gutekunst's presentation, we may, for this presentation, I would suggest limit our comments and actually just pose questions, if you will. And what I'd like to do is go through as we've done in the past, I'll go alphabetically down the list for every member, call on you. If you have questions, you can ask them. If you don't have questions at that time, you can pass. We'll go through. I will finish that round with my own questions, and then we'll do our lightning round where everybody raises their hand, but you don't use the raise hand function. You actually raise your hand, and then I'll call on you from there. And I think that's probably the best way to proceed. Please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking. And remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. And I want to just be able to identify each person who's the speaker. So I'll call on you, someone raises their hand, I'm going to say Rick Zambone, and then Rick can oppose his question or make a comment. So just wait until I yield the floor to you, and I'll recognize you by name, which will create a clear transcript. Every vote that we take, I know that we're going to have votes tonight, but any vote that we take is going to be done by roll call. And I think with that now, we can all turn to our meeting agenda. Chair's updates, I do not have any. And we will go directly to our Emory Grover update. And our superintendent of schools, Dr. Daniel Gudenkens, is with us. And what you should have received, and I'll let Dr. Gudenkens know that we have kind of a limited set of documents in front of us, which was a summary of a chair's meeting and I think three views of three different options for Emory Grover or the replacement of Emory Grover. They're floating around. There may be some other information that people have dug up and curated on their own through looking at minutes of other board meetings or minutes of the Permanent Public Building Committee. So just, you may end up having some questions based on that as well, just to forewarn you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gudenkens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the committee for taking the time to let me just check in with you. And actually, this is more of an update and a request for you to consider a possibility, but really mostly an update. And before I begin, I noticed in the attendees that School Committee Chair Andrea Longo-Carter and Vice Chair Connie Barr are attending. And I also see Steve Popper and Hank Half are attending. And if anybody on this committee throws me a hardball question, and these days any question's actually a hardball question for me, I'll probably defer to Steve or Hank or Andrea or Connie. In any event, this is, I was last before the CPC. Well, it was a couple of years ago, and it was really around the same thing. And at the time, I had mentioned to the CPC, I believe when Mr. Crossan was chair, that the school committee was interested in exploring a new feasibility study for the Emory Grover building. And it was a bit of a heads up that one of the things we know the community was possibly interested in was it possible to renovate the existing Emory Grover building, which has certainly outlived its utility and usefulness? And if so, would there possibly be some CPC funding available for at least a portion of it, if indeed it could be renovated? And the CPC at that time never made a commitment, but certainly was aware of it and did not dissuade us from moving forward with the feasibility study. And as the documents I provided you, which are really just a quick summary, in 2018, town meeting appropriated funds for feasibility, which has now been completed and has been presented to the Permanent Public Building Committee and to the school committee as well. The documents that you have before you that I forwarded to Ms. Lustig to your attention are brief, and they just provide a broad overview of the three options that are before the community for consideration and before the school committee for consideration. There were several options discussed. Part of the feasibility included exploring land and property outside the jurisdiction of the school committee within the town of Needham, and several of these sites were checked out and tested for fit and for practicality. There were additional considerations, for example, building school administration within a school project. That is something that's not funded by the Massachusetts School Building Authority. There were just a variety of different options considered. And BH Plus, Joel Bargman, who was our kind of our lead designer, really did a thoughtful, I think, and a creative job of vetting all possibilities. And at the end of the day, where we landed are on 3 options for the community to consider. And the options are not inexpensive. And they would require, of course, a plan for the community to decide how this would be funded in any event, regardless of the funding source, whether it's a debt exclusion or from the levy or partially funded by CPC or whatever. It's going to require serious conversation among the town boards and ultimately town meeting to decide how to afford a project. As you can see, the 3 options really, at the end of the day, are not far away from each other as far as cost is concerned. I won't go through all the details of each one, but just to share briefly, the first option, and they're not numbered in order of priority or preference, they're just numbered the way they are, is to use the acre parcel that the Emery Grover sits on, just about an acre, and tear down the Emery Grover, which, by the way, has some historic considerations, and we would have to go through a process to allow that to happen. And build a new school administration building that would meet the needs of the town for many generations to come, in a similar way that the Emery Grover building has met the needs of the community for well over 100 years. That is a $27.6 million project that would be all new construction. It would take advantage of that parcel in a little different way than it is right now. For example, moving the building closer to Highland Avenue. And in all these 3 cases, it would require parking, some parking to be remote. Remote, meaning the Stephen Palmer area where the Stephen Palmer building is right now, that long-term would be turned into parking, which would serve a community need, a real community need for parking in the downtown area, and also would provide for employees to park as well. The second option, which is a renovation with a 50-foot addition to the back, is actually the most inexpensive of options. Again, the options are within range of one another. A $27.3 million project. And what that is it guts the entirety of the building. I want to say in a similar way to Town Hall, but that wouldn't be fair because I'm not sure I understand exactly all the intricacies. I think it would be different in that there were some portions of Town Hall, for example, the staircases that were preserved, or the stage that were preserved. In this case, it would be an entire gut renovation of that building because the systems are failing, the floors, and the windows and everything. So it really isn't possible to save what's on the interior. And then there would be a 50-foot addition to the back. What would be preserved would be the facade and the exterior, and it would allow the community to retain the facade of that historical building pretty much as an anchor to your downtown area, sandwiched between the condominiums and St. Joe's Church and the downtown area. Which, by the way, one of the conversations that we did have is the importance, if it was possible, to keep school administration as close to Town Hall or in the downtown area as possible. It was not something that definitely had to happen, but it was certainly a preference if possible. And the reality is, if the building were torn, if school administration moved somewhere else, and that building were put up for sale, it has a limited desirability. The parcel itself perhaps worth up to $2 million, and I may be corrected by that by Steve or Hank, but not worth as much. And quite frankly, it is not desirable for any developer given all the constraints that would be put on that 1 acre parcel. So you'd be left with kind of a gaping hole in that smile of buildings, kind of a gap in the downtown area with really limited use. So that was another consideration if we could rebuild on that site in a way that would really meet the needs of school administration. And so the renovation with the 50-foot addition in the back was one way. The third option was also a renovation, keeping the facade the same, gutting the interior of the building, but adding an L-shaped addition with underground parking below it to aid with the overall parking situation. And that was the most expensive option at $28.6 million. All the options described have solar panels on the roof, and the idea, if town meeting can figure out the funding and the town can afford this project, there would be occupancy in September 2025. There are some different, again, for any option, there are pluses and minuses. I would say to you that I've been encouraging both the building committee and the school committee to be thinking about the most affordable option. And so although the delta between the two is small at this point, and if there were a way to partner with the CPC for some funding, I would recommend option 2 to the school committee. However, if there is no appetite among the community and within your board to support any kind of funding, then it would make sense to recommend option 1. In the end, it would be more expensive, but it would make the most sense given the considerations and all the studying that had been done. So what we have decided to do is, at the encouragement of the school committee, is to check in with you to give you the update that we did complete the study, that, as I said, I would come back and suggest to you that we would like you to consider seriously the possibility of some CPC funding for this project. And then we would continue to move forward to work with the town to see what makes the most sense for projects and in what order and how we go about doing that. Clearly, there need to be more conversations with different boards in town in any of these options, with any of these options, and funding source and town meeting approval. If things move forward, there was a viable funding source and a specific option chosen. Design funding would perhaps be a request at the 2021 annual town meeting, and construction could begin as early as, but no earlier than 2022. All that, though, is contingent on which option, how it's funded, and what makes the most sense for the community. So, Mr. Chair, I think with that as an overview, I will turn it back to you, and I will be happy to try to answer any questions that I can, and I will come back to you or respond in writing if I can't answer something tonight. And as I said, I may lean on some colleagues who might be able to help out this evening as well, with your permission.
All right, thank you, Dr. Goodenkatz. So what I think I'd like to do is go through a roll call and call on each member and ask if he or she has any questions for Dr. Goodenkatz. Let me tell you what I hope we can end up with coming out of this segment of the meeting is I want us to, we don't need to develop this tonight, but probably in our next meeting, is really develop a framework for examining this question, which is the CPC interested, as Dr. Goodenkatz used the phrase, partnering with the school committee in connection with the redevelopment of the Emery Grove School. And I think what we need to do is think about what objective criteria we may need and what are some of the subjective criteria that we should consider as well. So with that in mind, I guess what I would say is start that process by, you can start asking those questions of Dr. Gutenkantz, but this is going to be kind of we're going to have to gather our information, and then we're going to have to make a decision. And I assume, and all the members may disagree with me, we want to give some sort of sense of the board at some point that we would be amenable to, or not amenable, partnering, to use Dr. Gutenkantz's phrase, with the school committee in connection with the Emery Grover project. So I think that's how I would frame it, at least for this evening. If you disagree with me, that's fine. But I'm just trying to take this as kind of an issue and a problem. And how is it that we come to an answer for the town based on some data, objective factors, and maybe some subjective factors as well. So with that, why don't I start by calling on, I'll go alphabetically again. If you've got questions, or I guess you could have comments as well for Dr. Gutenkantz or the other town members here, town staff members here, then so be it. So I'll start with Paul Albert. Paul, do you have anything?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Gutenkantz. It's good to see you, and thank you for being here tonight and for
Good
your
to see you.
presentation. I really just have one question, which is the issue of what it might cost us. In our materials this week were some financial projections for what the CPC might be looking forward to in the future for some of the projects that we are currently paying for and might be before us. And there was, my recollection is that there was allocated on those projections, if we were to fund this project for the Emery Grover, approximately $11 million of the 27 million. Now, it's my understanding that with a complete gut renovation of the building, the only portion of the project that would qualify for CPC funds would be the preservation of the facade. And I would just like to know whether the feasibility study actually came up with a number or a percentage of what the cost of preserving the facade would be out of the roughly $27.5 million total cost that we're looking at, so that we could have a better understanding of what the school committee might be coming to the CPC and asking for. That's my question, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Albert. And for the rest of this call or conversation, I hope everyone will call me Dan. Every time someone says Dr. Gutenkantz, I'm looking over my shoulder to see who arrived, or someone need a COVID test or something. So please just call me Dan. That is a good question. I do not have the answer to that question. I'm sure that Mr. Popper, Mr. Half may have a question. One of my understandings of funding is that it is not necessarily just for this specific historic piece that you want to renovate, but that the funding could go to the project in general. I may misunderstand that. That was an understanding that I had. However, I'm certainly not as versed in how that works exactly. And in any event, I'll have to get you an answer about what a renovation of the facade, the shell, if you will, of the building, roof, facade, and sides would be.
Peter, would you be, I see that Hincalf has raised his hand. Would you be amenable to bringing him in to answer the question?
Yes, and actually I want to, Paul's, there actually, we have kind of that could be two questions, because obviously you can use CPC funds in the restoration of a historic structure that goes beyond just the gut and renovation. There's you can end up paying for the elevator and a number of any electrical and any number of other things. So it may be that Paul is asking two questions, and it may be that it could be based on this rough outline that you have now. What would what would you be looking for in terms of percentages of this total cost? And then slicing it kind of further, well, if we're just looking at simply what Paul described as the gut renovation of that part of the building, that may be a different number, it may be less. So I don't know if we can, I don't know if those figures are available now, but if we can have, if Hank has that information, I think I'm correct on that. Karis, anybody out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're mischaracterizing my understanding. It's not that, it's kind of the opposite. I'm not saying that we could fund the gut renovation. I'm saying we could fund the cost of preserving the historic portion, which is the facade. Now, whether we can fund a portion of the renovation that's kind of tied to that can expand on not just the direct cost, but some of the indirect costs, that's a possibility. And perhaps Mr. Half and or Mr. Popper could speak to that. But from what we discussed when we were talking about the renovations at the Memorial Park building and the building of the new facility at the swimming pool at Rosemary Lake, that's kind of my understanding of how we have to allocate what's CPC permissible and what's not.
I don't think we can resolve that at this moment, but let's have Half elevate him. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I may. If we look at the precedent of Town Hall, the Town Hall CPC funding was, I think, 3/4 of the total funding of the building because it also enabled the accessibility of the building, so the elevator, the egress stairs, because you have to make it fully code compliant. The bathrooms, all of the bathrooms throughout the building had to be replaced. And so I don't think that we would or could be looking for all of that, but I think this is very analogous, and at least 50 or 60% of the total cost of the renovation would be attributable to things, according to the architect, that could be eligible for CPC funding.
Can I ask a question? Actually, can Hank have his video activated? Is he able to do that so we can actually see him, Karis?
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Hi, Hank. Okay, and is that, are you talking about but you're not talking about 3/4 of the total project cost, are you? Because you're putting on a 50 by 100 foot addition for, say, option number 2. So we're not, when you say 3/4, are you saying?
No, I'm saying that was the precedent at Town Hall. And if you take the analogy of Town Hall, the issues of handicapped accessibility, of viable means of egress, of sprinklering the building, of bringing modern electrical and telecommunications into the building. A lot of those aspects, not just the facade, would be technically eligible. Now, we understand that there's limited funds, but the breakdown of the adaptive or the renovation of the facade is probably in the $1 to $2 million range. But there's also things like underpinning of the building, a whole variety of other things that in the renovation and addition to Town Hall, different metrics were applied, and it's pretty standard throughout the state to have those issues addressed in any renovation as eligible for CPC funding. Not always funded, but eligible.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, what I'm hearing is that Mr. Half is suggesting that it could be as much as 50 to 60% of the estimated cost. And so in round numbers, since the 27 million, let's round it up to 30 million, we could be looking at a maximum that could be asked of our committee of, say, 15 million to 18 million dollars.
I think we're being more realistic than that, but if you wanted to look at precedent and other situations in the state,
Yep.
I think easily 50% would be eligible.
So the $11 million that is on our financial documents that were provided to us sounds like it's a reasonable guesstimate in terms of what we could be considering here.
Yes,
Thank
and I can ask the designer for a more detailed breakdown if that's helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that might be helpful. Do you know, Hank, what the percentage was on the allocated to CPC for the restoration of Town Hall?
Steve may know better than I, but I do believe it was in the 75% range.
Okay. All right, Paul, any other questions?
No, I'm all set. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. All right. Joe Barnes.
Good evening, Dan. Welcome and thanks for taking time after a long day at work. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Joe.
Couple of quick questions. I get the impression that, well, first of all, it's taken a long time for Emery Grover to finally get to the front burner as it is right now. The usability of the building certainly has gone by many years ago, and you and your staff are great to be able to show up every day and do your work there. Is it fair to say that you are looking for work to be done that will make the building functional, welcoming, a place that you can feel proud that people will come and interact? It's not so much any one of these particular options, 1, 2, or 3. You're looking to get the job done. You did say that obviously the wisest financial option would be what you would want, but generally you want to get the job done. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the remote parking at Stephen Palmer. Does this still continue to have, the parking area that is near Emery Grover now, you share, are you allowed to share with St. Joseph's? Would that still be the case going forward?
We no longer share with St. Joe's. St. Joe's uses our entire parking areas as drop-off in the morning, particularly for kindergarten. This right now, we pretty much made an arrangement with St. Joe's that the parking is really only for Needham Public Schools staff. Now, part of that is I think they were able to get some more permits from the town for parking. And in any event, their need has decreased. So we're in pretty good shape. So this would not include parking for St. Joe's because it doesn't include it right now.
Okay. Good.
However, if depending on the disposition of Stephen Palmer, parking could be available there for both the Needham Public Schools and perhaps St. Joe's. I know that's something that we've kicked around in some planning sessions.
Okay. That's all I have right now, Peter. Thanks.
I apologize. Artie Crocker.
Thanks, Peter. Dan, you had, it's great thought that's been going into the whole process. One question I have is, what is the demo cost in scenario 1? So that's one thing. Just what is the demo cost?
Mr. Chair, with your permission, I will ask Hank to help me out with that particular.
Absolutely.
I don't have these numbers on the top of my head. I'm thumbing through, but
I'm
demolition.
sorry, Hank, you just have to, you have to identify yourself for the record. And it's
I'm sorry,
my
Hank.
responsibility and yours too. Hank Hamm.
Yes, and I'm a senior project manager with the building design and construction department with the town.
Thank you.
The demolition also includes abatement. There are a variety of hazardous material issues that would have to be addressed prior to either renovating or demolishing. I think we're probably in the $500,000 range with all the cleanup. And I should also note that in all of these, the project budget does also include temporary accommodation over at the Hillside Elementary School. And that is factored into each one of the cost estimates. So I'll leave it in that broad number range, in the $500,000 range. That's okay, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Artie, any other questions?
Yeah. So at some point, I mean, some of these are, coming at it, they're going to be hit questions at town meeting, for example, but, they're coming to my head right now, not directly related to staying at some of these scenarios or directly related to CPC aspect. So you mentioned cost related to the swing space over at Hillside. It would be nice to understand some of that cost as well. Because part of this is, the appetite, how, various CPC members and our appetite for what's going on. As we know, what's going on in society right now is taking everyone a hit, taking everyone back of what's going on with society. So I do not know what's going to happen when this gets in front of town meeting. I do not know what happened with the scenarios. I'm not saying they weren't asked. It probably was. What happened with scenarios as far as having the school administration somewhere else. I know you had said, Dan, that you prefer to have it in the center of town. But we do have the swing space at Hillside. We do have the Mitchell School scenario going on at some point. At some point, that Hillside building is going to be there. It would be nice to have a little better understanding, again, mainly because of what's going on in society right now. If there is a big pushback, what happens with timing, scenario, and cost, as far as if it isn't there. I know you're saying the value of that property is limited for some other developer, but it still has some value. And what happens if if the administration does go somewhere else? Clearly, it's probably 2025, but what happens if it's 8 years down the road, 9 years down the road, if it goes to Hillside? Because I think those questions are going to be asked, because I know I'm thinking of them. What's happening with cost of going over to Hillside and just keeping that the administration building in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Artie. There's no question that having a conversation about new construction in the times we're living in right now is a challenge for people to wrap their heads around. I know I certainly am. And just to be very candid, a parallel study is wrapping up, and that is a school facility study, particularly looking at Pollard, High Rock, and Mitchell. Two of those schools, Pollard and High Rock, Pollard and Mitchell, are in need of additional space and/or renovated space, or in Mitchell's case, a new building potentially. And those projects, depending on which option is chosen, are expensive projects for the town. And we actually wanted to see to help inform that process, and so the school committee had all the information it could to get a good handle on Emory Grover, so that when they are telling the story about school facilities, they'll have a good understanding of what total costs may be. And I think that's a wise thing to do, and that's part of the reason now to be coming to the CPC and returning to you to explain where we are and allow you to deliberate at some point to decide what you may want to or may not want to do in regards to Emery Grover. There were other options looked at. I won't go into all of those right now. And as far as Hillside, the big picture with Hillside is that once police and fire are done, the agreement with the school committee and the town is that the property, when the Hillside School is no longer needed for public education, the property would be returned to the town. Now that's indefinite because we could use Hillside temporarily for school administration. We could use it for swing space for school. For example, if the Mitchell School were constructed, Hillside would become possibly one of the options for swing space. So the Hillside School will be swing space for a little while. The issues at Hillside to renovate it, to reconstruct it into school administration, there are several challenges for doing that. Always possible, but I think the costs become a bit impractical. However, you're right, and we will consider when we do talk to town meeting what are all the different options that were considered, and why settle on these three. I do think these three, of all the options we had considered, are the best, probably the most affordable. But that depends again on available funding, as you're pointing out.
Thank you, Dan. You had mentioned in one of the scenarios that part of this includes cost of moving administration over to Hillside. Or, I'm sorry, Hank, you had mentioned that as well, that it involves moving the administration over to Hillside. Now I understand that may not be a full-blown renovation of Hillside to make it the administration, but it still involves cost of moving the administration over to Hillside and making it functioning for that purpose. Again, realizing that it may not be a full-fledged redo for that purpose. Again, I'm just bringing up things that are going to be brought up, and I appreciate everything that you're doing. It does sound like with the study going on, with the study of space going on with the schools, it sounds like there's still some scenarios that we may have to look at. So, I mean, we're here looking at CPC, but if the study's going on with all the schools and what may happen, the administration sounds like it may or should be part of that study, which may have some effect on what's going on with CPC. That's just what's going through my head. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks, Peter, as well.
Okay, thank you, Artie. Okay, continuing down our line alphabetically, Bob Dermody.
Can you hear me, Peter?
If you could boost your volume just a little bit.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Hi, Dan. Thanks for the presentation.
And this is Bob Dermody.
For bringing backup as well. So just a quick question I thought of when Artie was speaking, perhaps someone on your team knows, what's the square footage of the existing Hillside building? Just relatively in comparison, if not the exact number, to the space you occupy now.
Hillside is roughly a square footage. If you include the modulars, it's roughly double the size or more than double the size of where we are right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe the existing Hillside is around 65,000 square feet, I believe.
Okay.
So it's definitely double the size with a gymnasium, with modular classrooms, and all the spaces.
All right, thank you. And I was actually on the CPC liaison for the Emery Grover when it had gone to town meeting before several years ago. So this having these options, I think, is very helpful. And that was a pointed question from the floor of town meeting about the option to tear down. So I think it's important always to look at that. So these numbers are very helpful. Another way I'd like to look at it with all of us here, though, or ask Dan, the square footages for the three options from my quick review of the document range from about 31,000 to 34,000 and change. Now, is there anything missing in one of those options? It's not a big difference in square footage, but are you happy with all the spaces in all three options? Can you run your business in any of those options?
Yes, yes. All three options. And I have to confess, it may have to do with, I think the largest one is kind of the long arm off of the Emery Grover building. And I think that just may be a function of the construction. But yes, one of the things that we lack is appropriate meeting space. This addresses that with the addition of some conference space, including a conference room. It allows us to pull our IT department inside the building. Right now, most of IT is located at Broadmeadow in the basement. Well, it's not really a basement. That's not fair. It's in a it's kind of in a windowless concrete portion of the building that's built into the hill, and it's not the space is really not accommodating for the purpose with a variety of issues. In any event, yes, any one of these scenarios meets our requirements for many years to come.
All right, that's really good to hear, because I think that's another way to compare these as opposed to just dollars and cents. I want to make sure that the school committee has the best facility that we can afford to get it, given what you've gone through in the current building. So I think that's all I have for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Okay, Laura Dorfman. Laura?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Dan. Just
Hello.
a couple of quick questions on the three options. So the third option with the underground parking, which is the most expensive option, but as you said before, not really by so much. It has the lowest number of parking spaces, and I'm wondering why, if you're underground, that couldn't be something different with more parking spaces.
That is a good question, one I hadn't really thought about in that way.
Can I jump in? If I can, Dan, can I jump in?
Yes.
But there's probably a fourth slide there. Option 3 rotated with underground parking. I think there's another document floating.
Oh,
out.
yeah. I'm sorry.
We did not get that.
You did not?
No.
Oh, that wasn't in the packet that I forwarded?
It wasn't in the packet.
I apologize for that. So let me be clear. You have the option. It's called option 3 rotated. Is that the title in red? It says 42 spaces, Laura. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
Exactly, yes.
I apologize. There is an option 3 rotated with the garage under the addition that actually has 50 spaces in total, with the 16 spaces in a garage and 34 spaces outdoor parking. It really looks the same as this. It's just that it shows the outline of the 16 spaces in the garage. I apologize that did not make it into your packet.
No, that's fine. But some of the
I'd
others
have to fire somebody, but that would be me, and I don't want
we
to.
can't
actually,
fire anybody now.
I just want to, can I further clarify, which is that option, which is option 3 rotated with underground garage, is the $28.6 million, not option 3 rotated with surface parking. Just so I think I've got that correct, right, Dan?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so my question still is, that's still fewer parking spaces than some of the other options, and why are we limited underground? I mean, I know we can't go all anywhere we want, but why are we limited in that way underground?
I could not answer. I could not give a cogent response to that. Again, I would have to lean on Hank or Steve to give an engineer's response to that question. I think it has to do with geometry, quite frankly, and available square footage. But
Okay, and is 62 spaces enough?
so there's always regarding parking, and of course that's a challenge because, as you can see, that there would have to be some zoning bylaw changes for any one of these scenarios, or for a couple of the scenarios anyhow. right now, there are 44 folks who work in the Emery Grover building. And we have some van drivers who reside part-time, and that in between runs, they come in. But there are 42 to 44 folks who work in the Emery Grover building. It is the hub for when people come in for meetings, to register their children for special education needs. And so the 62 spaces actually would be generous because it would provide, or 48 spaces would be generous because it would meet the need of the number of people in the building. However, the reason we're looking at and considering remote parking at what is now the Stephen Palmer building is because we are hoping this building, we are expecting this building will also be a place where we can do training. We do not have a place in the Needham Public Schools where we can do training for a large group of folks.
And you need parking, you need more parking for that, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Okay, Laura, are you finished? Okay, now Rick Zambone. Rick.
Did you forget Chris?
Hi, Rick.
Chris, I apologize, Chris. Very sorry.
Not a problem. Dan, Hank, it's great seeing you guys. I hope you and your families are all well during this time, and it's great to see you guys live on Zoom. I will honestly say that all the questions that I had were either asked prior or discussed during this whole open dialogue. But I will echo Mr. Dermody's saying of that the school committee building that you folks are in right now is very inadequate. Something needs to be done. You need to have a better facility to do something like this. One of the attractions that Needham has is our school system. So when we have all these great schools, but we don't have an administration building to go with this, that's kind of what we're lacking in. So I think this is great that you folks have done your homework. I know there will be questions during town meetings, but I think this is something that needs to be done, and I appreciate all the diligence and homework that you folks have done.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Chris. All right, now Rick Zambone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dan, welcome. It's been a long time since we've sat together. I have a number of questions and a number of comments as well. I'm going to come at it from a little bit different perspective. I'm almost going to want to go back all the way to where Paul started the conversation. I don't think there's a question in anybody's mind that the building is not needed. It is. It was needed 10, 12, 15 years ago. One of the problems that we had, referring to Hank Half's conversation about comparing this to the town hall, was there was a lot of concern back then that perhaps the boundary had been stretched on what qualified under CPC money for the town hall. And there was a vow back then as well, because I was involved with it with the finance committee, that we wouldn't repeat that same mistake. Now, this doesn't go to the 75% level that the town hall perhaps did. This is more, if my calculations are right, on the spreadsheet, it looks like it's more 40% was being proposed, which is gets us around the $11 million mark. But I noticed that Hank mentioned the $1 to $2 million would be just to preserve and repair the facade, and the rest of the cost is for all of the other things. My question goes to, how did we come up with the 40% of the $11 million? What went into that process? Not so much what equipment or what work was going into that project, but how did we come up with the round number of 40%? Was this a trade-off between what the town can afford under the levy or under override? Or did somebody take a look at how much money the CPC has? I mean, how did we come up with this 40% number?
Mr. Chair and Rick, thank you for the question. I don't know that I can answer that question because and again, if Hank or Steve has an answer to it, I don't know exactly what the percent should be. Part of it is doing the feasibility is coming up with what are the options and what's the cost, and then seeing what can be afforded by the town. My purposes here this evening are to come back and share this with you, and also ask you on behalf of the school committee, to take this up at a future meeting about whether or not you want to fund even a portion of it, according to your regulations and the rules. But what the exact percentage is, Mr. Chair, I'd have to defer to Hank or Steve, because I'm not sure where that number derived from.
Okay, I don't know if Hank or Steve Popper might offer some insight into that. I do know that we have always had the figure of an approximate $28 million cost with respect to Emery Grover as a placeholder. My assumption is that 40% was also a placeholding figure. I could be wrong about that, but I but those were always approximates, but maybe some of our staff, and in particular, Steve Popper could shed some light on that. I don't think that it ever was that as I said, these were estimates and placeholding figures. I don't think that there ever was a statement that it was going to be $11 million. It was going to be, there was going to be a cost, and it was an approximate amount of a contribution of $11 million. If anyone can give us some historic reference to that, who's in attendance, fine.
Yeah, and if not, Mr. Chair, I'll try to connect with the town manager and others to see.
Yeah, I guess I would need to go back to this is Hank Half again. I would need to go back to the architect to see what their analysis was. But just in terms of the existing conditions, when you talk about the facade, well, you're actually talking about the entire envelope of the building, that in order to preserve that building and get it up to contemporary codes, we would have to put in new structure within it. We'd have to brace it laterally for seismic. We actually are trying to preserve the chimneys. The roof would have to be totally reconstructed. All of the windows would need to be replaced with historically appropriate fenestration. I think the entire facade would have to be repointed both inside and out. So when you start adding up each one of those pieces, there are savings, and there are lots of reasons why you want to save an old building like this, but it's also an expensive approach. And masonry alone, let's see, we're in the $750,000 range. We're 1.5 in range in terms of dealing with the existing conditions. So we would have to come back with more detail.
Thanks, Hank. Mr. Chair, just a couple other questions, if I could. I noticed there was a whole list of zoning, planning issues that were on all of these. Has there been any discussion about how likely or for whatever reason, the planning board or the town, if we have to make zoning changes, was there any thought process given to how difficult or easy that might be?
There have been some preliminary discussions, and yes, there are some challenges here. I think particularly with the FAR ratios, and of course, as always, just the parking. There have been really soft conversations, but we haven't, obviously we have not gone formally to ask for any specific consideration, and this would have to come before town meeting as well. So yes, there's no question there are challenges to any one of these options.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. And just this is more of a comment. I'm just concerned as we look at this, as people are concerned about the town's ability to afford it, and people trying to make some decisions on how we spend the money to get there. As a member of the CPC, and I'm speaking for myself, it's going to have to be well thought out and well defined as to how we come up with a number that folks are going to be asking us to evaluate. And so I'd ask that in preparation for us to weigh in on this and make some type of decision, we get as much detail and rationale as we can get at this stage, so that we can make a good balanced judgment. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rick. Let me follow up with a couple of questions that I have, and maybe pivoting from what Rick is saying. I think in the past, what we have done, and we've seen proposals from proponents that where the architects, basically being almost advocates, if you will, on behalf of the proponents, are lay out to us in detail what it is that they believe is eligible for CPC funding as a historic preservation. And so I'm wondering, and my question for Hank is, have your architects actually, when they come up with these proposals, or option 3, let's say, or option 2 rather, have they actually put pen to paper and say, and according to our calculations, based on the precedent of how you evaluated and funded the restoration of Town Hall, you can ask for X number of dollars, or X number of dollars are eligible for CPC funding, and here is our reason why. Has that analysis been done by the architects?
Not in the level of detail that you're asking for.
Okay.
But we certainly can do that.
I think that would be helpful. It's almost, it's somewhat, I think it's a little bit of what Rick Zamboni was asking about. And so that would be, I think that would be helpful for us to know. A couple of general questions that I have about the restoration. I noticed that there is about, I think maybe a 2,000 square foot delta between a tear down and rebuild and say option 2. And my understanding is that functionality is basically the same. Does that indicate that there's some inefficiencies in the usage of space in connection with the restoration and addition? And if so, how much is it? What's the significance?
Yes, there are inefficiencies, particularly in the attic and in the basement area within that building. As I mentioned, there are the 2 chimneys that go up the middle of the building, and we would be trying to preserve those. And those are basically voids that are unusable. So yes, there are inefficiencies.
And Hank, is that an example of the inefficiency, or are you identifying some major sources of the inefficiencies?
Those are examples of the inefficiencies.
Okay.
When you tear down the building, well, there's also, because the floors of the existing building don't align with the ground floor of the new building, there are some inefficiencies in having the second level merge all the way across and the third level merge all the way across. So they're adequate stairs, which the building doesn't currently have, plus the elevator. So all of those contribute toward some of those inefficiencies.
Okay, and not to get too granular, but so our second and third floor are married. Is there some mismatch on the first floor between the old building and the proposed addition?
Yes, I don't have the cross section to show you,
fine. That's
but
fine.
It's about a half a level difference. So when you come into the new building, you'd be coming in from the parking lot side, and that would be at grade. And you have to go up a half a level to get to what is the current main floor of the existing building, or down a half a level to get to the basement level.
Okay. And then 2 other questions, if I may. One is there some analysis about maintenance costs going forward? I assume that the newer building would be, it would be lower cost to maintain. That's an assumption. If I'm wrong about that, let me know. And if there's been an analysis, again, I'm not an expert in that area. I don't know if there has been an analysis, or even if that's an appropriate thing to have at this stage.
I think older buildings will be, even when fully renovated, might be a bit more expensive to maintain. But we do not have a detailed analysis of that.
Okay. And my last question is, I assume the renovation with the addition is going to be the height is going to be is it going to be significantly taller than if we tore it down and built a new building? And if I'm right about that, what is the amount? What's the delta? And is that something that I'm concerned a little bit about the neighbors, especially with, the L-shaped, the option 3 rotated? That looks like a building that's pretty close to the property line that's going to go back, I think, 150 straight feet. I could be wrong about that. And is there some sense that may be a real problem with the neighbors? So I'm asking two different questions, but most of them are around, are we going to get pushback from the neighborhood in connection with the renovation and addition? And is that something that we've explored, have soft talks about, or we think based on the visuals that we've seen, it's not going to be much of an issue?
Well, we haven't, Mr. Chair, we have not had conversations with the neighbors. I would note that the rotated option with the wing would actually mirror what's going on in the St. Joe's parcel in some ways. So it would make it, perhaps might make it look a little bit more dense there, but I don't think it would stick out any more than the rear of St. Joe's Church, preschool, little convent, and the other structures there. In any event, we haven't gone that far to solicit community or neighborhood feedback yet.
And if I may, the existing building is existing non-conforming in height. It's already too high. It was built well before the zoning bylaw ever came into being. And the new addition, in order to have the floors align and make it efficient for the interconnection, would also have to be equal in that height. So the massing, yes, the massing would be higher in either option 2 or 3, whereas height in option 1 would be conforming to the bylaws.
Okay, thank you. All right, those are my questions. Do members of the committee have any follow-up questions? Karis?
Hi, I just had one question. When do you think you'll be going for an application towards the CPC? Usually our application process is in December. So would it be of December of 2020 or 2021? And would you be looking at design as well as construction, or just construction?
Well, we do have to go for design for sure. And the initial thought is annual town meeting in May of 21, for design and construction to follow. I think you've laid it out about right, Karis, what we probably do. I think the purpose for this evening's conversation, and I appreciate you getting this on the agenda so quickly, is really just to share with the CPC where we are. The study is essentially complete, and it now has to, the community needs to begin to have a conversation about what makes the most sense. It is also, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're having also the conversation about other school facilities. The other school facilities, by the way, would not be able to accommodate school administration necessarily, nor would they be eligible for CPC funding or for MSBA funding. So those are not under consideration to do anything like that. However, the school committee is very much interested in laying out to the community, here is what our needs are for the next several years in key building needs. And so this conversation was to surface the options with the CPC, get some questions from you, which we certainly have received this evening, and come back to you with some more information, which I would respectfully ask that we're able to do at some point in the future, perhaps as has been suggested by the chair, maybe with the architect who can provide some more detailed responses. But we can certainly work on that. So I think, in sum, I think what you're laying out, Karis, is quite possibly what could happen once we provide more information for the CPC and the school committee decides on an option.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Karis. Any other questions? I think I saw Bob Dermody. Was your hand up or no? Okay, additional questions from any members? No. Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Dan, for coming. Thank you, Hank, for stepping up and handling those additional questions. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Hank. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of CPC. We'll see you soon. Stay safe.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
You too.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Dan.
folks.
Thank you.
Dan and Hank, good to see you both.
Yeah.
You too. Take care.
Thanks, Hank.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if I may, a question of the CPC Act. I didn't necessarily want to speak it out there, but does the Act speak to who actually determines what is fundable and what is not? Who has the right or the responsibility to make that determination?
So it's you, it's the committee, and it can be brought to court, like we've seen with some of these church hearings. But it's the discretion of the committee as following the statute, and then if somebody disagrees with the interpretation, it would be the courts.
Wonderful. Because in my short time on the committee, it seems that this is an issue that has come up a fair number of times. And it seems also to behoove the proponents to ask for as much as they possibly can, and they may have more data and therefore more knowledge about what is actually in these projects. I would like us to talk about that at some point, how we feel. I'm not comfortable just using prior projects in town as precedents. I think that's a slippery slope, and we've heard some comments to that effect this evening. So I just wanted to ask that question and let the committee know I am concerned about how that is actually determined. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And I think that what I had represented, I think, is kind of accurate, which is the architect, in effect, becomes somewhat of an advocate for the proponent. But that's why having an architect on our committee is very important. And I guess we should have a discussion about whether or not we agreed with prior analysis, that may be we'll have an opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Laura.
Sorry, I'm just naive to all this because I'm so new, but my question is, if they were to rebuild it and sort of try to replicate the facade as if it were still an historic piece of the building, does that enable us to provide funding or not because it's new construction?
So the precedent is Town Hall, where they did do a renovation of a structure, inside and exterior, to preserve some of the character of the historic features. Whether or not the percentages, I think might be a question, but it is something that has been eligible in the past.
No, I'm not sure. Laura, are you saying tearing down and rebuilding something that looks like the historic structure?
Well, what I'm saying is one of the options was a complete demo and a renovation. And the facade of the building is really, I think, the important piece to this in terms of history for the community and for us. If maybe I'm wrong about that, but if I'm right about that, and it's preserving what the building looks like, but it can be done with new construction, but it's still the facade and the historic elements are still replicated in a way that make people feel like they're looking at the older building. Is that the cost of that eligible for CPC funding, even though it's new construction?
No, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, option 1 is not eligible for CPC.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can't, right, it's not eligible. And
Okay.
it was one of the early proposals that I saw was an actual facadist renovation. That is, you actually preserve the front wall and the side wall. You kind of build a structure to hold it in place, and then you build a building and attach it to it.
Mm-hmm.
The facade and the preservation of the facade would have been, and maybe some tie-ins to it, electrical and some other matter, HVAC related to the continued preservation of the facade would have been eligible for CPC funding, but that obviously was not a proposal that made it to us or to
Right.
consideration.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may possibly give a little bit of insight, because we did have a presentation in front of the planning board, which had more slides to it than what was presented here. And kind of to answer Laura's question, option 1 that was presented to the planning board for a total demolition and rebuild had a totally modern building presented to us as what the new construction would look like. There was no attempt in the demolition option 1 example to preserve the current look of the building. Just want to throw that in there for what it's
Okay,
worth.
thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay, Joe?
A question here about the funding from our end, if in fact we ever decided to move ahead with this. You know, the $11 million, 40%, that's being bandied about. Whatever the amount is that let's say we decided to appropriate or vote on, how does that impact our work going forward? Does that stifle any work that we might be able to, or any applications we might be able to entertain in the near and distant future?
So I guess I put down some notes of things to consider and maybe some additional documents that we might want. And so one of them, I think, is I'd like to know what the potential total ask would be and where they come up with that number.
Yeah.
I would like to know if we do fund this, even at the $11 million range, is what is the cost for that in terms of other projects that we are not going to get the fund? Another way of putting it is, well, what are we going to spend the 2% and plus the match on anyway? Because it ends up being about $3 million a year. One issue that Paul raised was, well, what about funding available to acquire open space? So that's one thing he actually, it was kind of an off the cuff remark, but it was interesting. So my thinking on that was, well, is there office, my question for the town, is there open space that we may have our eye on that's going to be more than $1 million? Because right now we have $1 million in that reserve. And so could we potentially be giving up an acquisition of open space? And maybe drilling down even further, if we're somewhat constrained in terms of bonding, if we go this route of funding an $11 million project and we have bonding obligations both to complete the town hall cost of the town hall as well as the pool, can we bond based on the amount that's actually designated for the contributions to open space? You know, that is, we get about $300,000 a year that's required to go into that bucket. Can that be a number that actually can be used to bond? I don't know enough about town finance to know that, but that may answer the question of, well, we might want to acquire open space. How could we do that if it's beyond the cost of what's in the bucket, which is always about $1 million or so a year? So, and I think the same would go with respect to community housing. Is there something out there that we know of that we want to have an opportunity to fund? I noted those three. I gave you those two examples because those are kind of the three buckets, if you will: historic, open space, community housing, and then we have our kind of general bucket. So that, you know, I'd like to know that information, and so I'm with you on that. So that's the question I guess I have for the whole committee, and I guess some data that we need to get from the town. One thing that I thought about asking about was, well, how much money in the end, after our 20 or 30 years of spending CPC money, how much money did we end up devoting to historic preservation? I mean, we've got a significant amount of money that we spend on town hall, and then this is going to be another, you know, $11 million. Is that how we want to spend? You know, do we want to end up spending $30 million on historic preservation out of a total of, say, $60 million? Is that good public policy? Is that what we're supposed to, are we honoring our obligations on the CPC by doing that? Maybe we are, but at least we can have a little discussion about that. How much money have we ever spent on open space, acquiring open space? And is it because we're in a densely populated town where open space is not readily available for acquisition? Okay. How much money have we spent on community housing? And why haven't we done that? I mean, those are kind of the obligations that we have under the Act. I'm not trying to direct us in any particular way, but I want us to actually think about that. You know, how is it going to look? And is that what we want to do? We may always determine that this is all a very good project and a very good use of the funds. See, the Community Preservation Committee applauds us and says, you people have the largest, to this date, you have the largest expenditure made for historic preservation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're applauded for spending that amount of money on the historic restoration of Town Hall. So maybe we're going down the right path. But what I'd like to do is kind of get that data. Let's get that information in front of us. Okay? Sure, Rick.
I gotta find my unmute button. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple comments just as you were talking. I was thinking, while we may be lauded for our efforts in spending money towards historic preservation, the fact of the matter is that the CPC back then was basically used as a funding source because the town didn't have enough money to do the building. There was no noble effort in restoring Town Hall to all of its historic splendor, other than the fact that it was a good source of funds that the town didn't have from other sources, and they didn't want to go forward with an override. And that was the biggest problem back then with the money that was spent on Town Hall. But be that as it may, that's kind of ancient history. Bring us to the present. There are going to be, and one of the problems that I had in listening to the presentation was the assumption that the school building, the administration building, needed to be near Town Hall and near the center of town. That's a critical assumption to the whole analysis about why we're looking at the Emery Grover building. And quite honestly, times have changed. There's going to be all sorts of commercial buildings available relatively inexpensively. Maybe not designed for school administration, but I mean, you just go across 128 and you're going to find that in a very short period of time, TripAdvisor might not be in that building. I don't know if that's economic or not. I'm sure that no one's even brought that up because of the premise that you have to be close to the center of town. There's going to be other property that's around that's going to be eligible for purchase. And those are the questions I think that Artie's kind of hinting at when you get into the town meeting and people are going to ask the question, why? You know, why are we there? And I don't want them to go back and start the whole study all over again. But clearly, those questions have to be answered when we get the town meeting floor by someone, I would think. So.
Okay, those are good points. That's my question, and I have been considering them leading up to this meeting. And I wonder, you know, is that really our job as a committee? That's kind of, you know, are we really supposed to be in the position of saying, you know what, we think you should be looking across 128 and looking to rent rather than, and because we're here as a source to preserve historic artifacts. But to your point, I think that we would have to defend this. This, if we did make a grant, I think that we would end up being in a position of defending it before the finance committee. I think I'm going to have to think this through, and I think that those would likely be questions that come up. And so I have to I think we have to think this through, but I'm a little concerned about our role being too expansive, if you will. Those are all legitimate concerns. I guess the question is, whose responsibility is it to do that kind of due diligence, if you will? And I guess it's an open question that I have. I don't have an easy answer on it. I do know that I've been there with Rick. We're in a position where we have to defend the underlying claim itself in front of the finance committee. So those questions are going to come up. Don't really know what our role is in connection with that. Karis?
I just wanted to indicate that right now there is no application in front of us for the Emery Grover specifically. So I know we're talking about a lot of details regarding expectations or information. And I think the reason that a lot of that isn't available is because they're not at the stage yet where they're ready to put an application before us. And I think they're just looking for a little bit of feedback as they start to sort through their options to then decide, all right, now we're ready to go for design funding and ask for an actual appropriation from CPC.
Well, I think we need to give them, we need to give them feedback. And I guess I'd like a sense of the committee of, I was a little unfocused, but I was trying to kind of put together a list, if you will, of some additional information that we may want to get in front of us as a committee in order for us to give, I think, a sense of the committee about whether or not we would be willing to partner. We're not talking about I don't know that we're talking about the number. We may want to indicate that as well. And so I kind of listed a few things. I think that, and so I'd like a sense of the committee of, is there additional information? Do you think that I've got that wrong? Or are you looking for some additional information that Karis, or, remember it's Dave Davison who's put together our financial summaries, the most recent of which is dated 2/25/2020. That's the one where the last page shows what the impact is of the Emery Grover bonding on our cash flow, if you will, as a committee. So if there's additional information that you folks think that you need in front of us, and I think I would anticipate having kind of a discussion maybe in our next meeting or the meeting after that to get some sort of sense from the committee to go back, to communicate back to the school committee. That's how I would frame it. I welcome anyone's input either on how I'm framing it or additional information that you think you need in front of you in order to give a sense of the committee back to the school committee. Think I have that right, Karis? That makes sense to you? Okay, Artie?
Yeah, I suppose I'd say for Dave Davidson is get his crystal ball together and think, what is the impact of today's economics in the future? Is there going to be an impact? I know we all want to get through this. We all want to push forward. We all want to get to something back to normal. It's going to be a different normal. We want to get back to something. I would like to have some sense from Dave Davidson if there's any thoughts of from the state what might be going on with our a different money coming towards us. Because I have no idea. I can imagine there could be a difference, but I don't know what that difference is. I'd like to get an idea.
Sorry, you're on mute, Peter.
All right. So I think we'll, Karis, if we can get some information, if Dave has it.
Yep, and Dave, I think, is going to be attending either our July or our June or July meeting. So we'll have him here. He didn't have any updates to the financial statement from February, but indicated that he could attend after town meeting.
But again, I mean, I'm talking about, possible future predictions. I mean, the crystal ball, some sense, because, I guess we know what now is, but I just want to get some sense of thoughts of what might happen. That's all.
Sure.
Okay. And Rick? Yeah, Rick, you have to unmute.
I thought I did. Okay, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, I think as part of your discussion earlier on, you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as if you're looking at this from 80,000 feet. What is it, as we look at what we have in front of us for where we spent money to date, how do we go about spending money in the individual buckets? What are the priorities that we have? Is it a priority for us to spend $11 million on historical renovation? Should that be where we want to spend $11 million? My concern is that we're looked at as a bank, a source of money. And the project of the day happens to be the historic renovation of Emery Grover building. If it was something else other than historic renovation, I might be a little bit more sympathetic because we haven't spent that. I mean, as you say, look at the history of where we've spent our money and look at where we're going forward in the future. I have to say that we spent a lot of money on historic renovation. We spent a lot of money upgrading fields and doing things for sports programs in town, but we haven't done much for low-income housing. We haven't done much for open space. And, should we be committing a significant portion of our money, again, towards something that's outside of one of the four buckets? I don't have an answer. I'm just thinking that's how we should probably look at the next phase of this.
Okay, so we can put together data where we can look at every project that we funded, and we can actually do an analysis. And so we can put that out in front of all of us. Okay, and bear in mind that preserving historic structures is one of our jobs. So that's one of the things that we're supposed to do. But I understand your point, but let's get that data. Let's put it in front of us. I also want to point out one other thing that I learned. Maybe everybody on the committee knows this, but that building's on the National Historic Registry. So that's although some people, have called it a dump and maligned it, it's actually a historic structure. One of the few buildings in town that is on the National Historic Registry. Just saying. Okay. So that's something for us to consider. But you're speaking to my point. That way we have some data that's in front of us, And we can go, that's one of those kind of objective factors that we can look at. There are some subjective things that we can look at, but whatever decision that we make and how much we agree to fund, let's have it driven by as much data as we can, rather than just kind of look and feel and guess, okay? And the data's out there, and we have projections. And so we can work with that. And I'll work with Karis offline to try and put together that kind of information so that we can actually start having an analysis about it, and you can have some actual information right in front of you, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, Mr. Dermody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the interest of full disclosure, my father attended that school back in the day, but I still think I can be impartial in all our deliberations. I'm fascinated by this discussion of our sort of legacy almost, or our role in the town. I think it is an important one to look at the broad picture, but are we not also sort of doing the job of the applications that come in? I mean, I would love to build public housing, but I can't go out and write an application to my own committee. So we are charged with receiving the applications and acting on the ones that we receive. So I think that has to be factored in. And I would be curious to read this data that hopefully we can compile. I think it will be interesting reading how much we funded to whom. But maybe somewhere in that list is who haven't we funded, if there is such a list, or who do we fund at 50% of their request? And that may start to be getting too detailed, but these are some of the thoughts I've had. And then one other question, maybe it's a procedural one, but so say somebody comes to us, I don't know who, somebody comes and asks for $11 million, and we as a committee decide, great project, we're gonna give you $5 million. What happens next?
We can do that.
Great. And we don't have to worry about where they go get the other money, correct?
That's correct. But I mean, remember, yes, I mean, if you're thinking that we're going to say in response to the school committee, you know, if that's what you're saying, I don't know.
Well, I'm just saying that I've said this out loud before. I think it's these people come to us and tell us this is what we need from you, you know, but we're the committee that gets to decide how we spend our money. And I think we need to remember that. I'm not opposed to looking forward or asking for more data or talking to the town about other projects, but we don't always have to fund every penny that is asked for. And that might allow us to then fund other things. That's what I want to say.
I think that's a valid point. I think you're in a very good position if you can actually then back that up with something like, and our understanding is there's a possibility that X parcel may potentially be available and it could cost Y number of dollars. And so we want to at least have that available to us. The same could be stated with respect to, you know, support for community housing.
And one last thing real quick, you know, if someone's asking for something that's 3 times what we have in a year, I think that needs to be factored in, because then presumably that precludes everything else. And I think that's something as a committee we have to be very wary of.
So it would be a bonded request, and we have cash flow projections that were provided to us, and that's part of that, the 225-20 financial summary provided to us by Dave Davies. And you know what we'll do is we'll get into that in a little more granular detail, probably in our next meeting. I think.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? Okay. So thank you. That was long. And thank you for your patience. And if I apologize if we went on for too long, I do. So now we want to do liaison updates and some further discussion. What I had hoped to get out of both the First Baptist Church and the First Parish Church, I was hoping to get to some basic terms for potential agreement. I don't know if that's too ambitious for tonight, but I looked at it and I thought we might be able to do that pretty quickly and efficiently. But why don't we first start with updates just from the liaison, first with respect to First Baptist Church. Any updates?
All right. So make sure I get my firsts correct here. So the First Baptist, I did have a lovely conversation with the Reverend Darren She is pleased to report that everybody in her community is still healthy, so that's good news. And I pointedly asked her, has anything changed with respect to your finances? And she said, nothing.
Okay,
That's my report.
great report. Okay, so now, Laura, your hand is up.
Yes. Do you guys know, so the PPP money, which is the Paycheck Protection Program, is available to religious institutions. Do we know if either of the firsts applied for that PPP money?
The First Parish Church did receive some CARE Act funding, yes.
Okay. I just think that's relevant. We should know how much they got because that would change their financial situation. Do you know?
I
Bob-
don't know. That was, excuse me, Bob, let me just jump in here. That was part of the discussion I had with Carl Francesi, who was representing Reverend Katie, who's on maternity leave. He said that the church has, during this period of time, his words, taken a hit. Not a huge hit because they did apply for some CARE Act funding, and that helped. They've lost quite a bit of rental income, as we understand.
Yeah, of course.
It didn't impact him at all as far as their request for they're committed to the 25,000. I couldn't get him to discuss whether, in fact, the percentages would change. He pretty much said that they're still committed to the project and the 25,000 they could raise, and that would be their commitment. So that happens to be the First Parish report, actually.
Okay, so that's our update.
Yeah.
Well, part of the request for additional information was to make sure that the entities continue to be financially viable. So they've taken a hit, if you will, but they've had some CARES Act funding, and we've just heard that basically from First Baptist Church that they're in fine financial shape. All right, Bob.
Okay, and I spoke with my co-liaison, Joe, about this. My concern upon reflection is that I was not specific enough in my inquiry to the Reverend. I think my question perhaps was too general. Thank you, Laura. I had not thought of the PPP, so we didn't speak to that. And without being too general, I'm just curious. I want to make sure she understands that I was asking about their contribution to the project as opposed to their desire for our funding. I think she made it clear that they want to do the project. They want to continue seeking funding from CPC. I think if people think it's a good idea, I'm happy to go back to her and say, we've met and discussed again. I just want to be clear that their portion of the money is still viable to do this project.
Yeah, and the PPP money really is it's asked for and pretty much granted unilaterally. What has to happen after the amount is requested is that the requester has to document payroll expenses and other qualified expenses to support the request, and whatever that amount is forgiven. And that's sort of the unknown now in the banking world. But they're all basically, the requests are all being approved. And so I just think as we look at, especially the ones with the bigger amounts, we just want to know, do they have that source of funding that might offset some of their, parishioner contributions or, whatever else, whatever other income sources that they have.
I think that we can keep it in terms of a general inquiry. I mean, obviously, if they're getting PPP funding, right, it's likely going to be a grant, and that's going to offset any losses of collections. Our concern as a committee is, do you continue to be a financially viable entity? And are you going to be able to contribute the dollars that you represent, you were going to contribute at the time of your application, even in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Is that fair?
I agree, and I think that's what these funds are for.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. I will use your words.
Okay. Okay, so let's quickly go through the updates, and then we can figure out if we want to have some time and energy to talk a little bit about some basic terms on our suggested contract discussion points. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. All right, so Needham Community Farm, is there any update?
No update at this time.
Thank you. And the Needham Conservation Trail Identification Design, no update at this time. Needham DPW Park and Rec, Claxton Field Light and Skin renovation.
I have no update on that one. I would like to just put my 2 cents in. I would like to put off any comments on what you'd like to talk about after this for our next meeting, as opposed to continuing on it tonight.
Okay, fair enough, Artie. And then next, resurface synthetic track at the DeFazio Field. That's 2017.
I don't think we have any updates, do we, Paul?
I don't have any updates, no.
Okay.
And I'm not expecting any. I think DPW is pretty much set with their presentation and what they're asking for, and as we saw before. So, you know.
Unless does Chris have any? Chris, do you know anything more than we know about that?
No, I mean, they pretty much had everything, buttoned up tight, ready to go.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, that was my impression too.
Okay.
Okay, so before we go on to approved minutes, let's just stay focused on the projects. So several months ago, I don't know how many months back, Rick had put together a document called Suggested Contract Discussion Points, and that was for the CPC, and that was in connection with the 2 grants to the churches. And that was before we had our consult with town council, and he kind of gave us some guidance, which was the equivalent of keep it really simple and don't get too entangled. And so Rick's document is I think a good, would serve as a good place to kind of to launch the discussion from. I don't think that we need to do it tonight. I think that in my mind, I kind of envisioned the document being, again, relatively simple because of the constraints that we're under with respect to the Kaplan case and the advice that we've gotten from our town council. So I think that the business terms that Rick has put together could be a good document for us to have in front of us at our next meeting, and we can quickly go through it and then turn over the document to our council and begin that kind of process. Kind of what I had called the slow roll of putting together an agreement that would be similar for both the First Baptist Church and the First Parish Church. I know that's different than what I had proposed for this meeting, but we've got Dr. Gutenkantz in front of us, and we have a long and expansive discussion. Artie suggests we put it off until next meeting. I'm fine with that. How does the rest of the committee feel?
Great.
All right.
I agree.
We need this document. I think that I can't remember if I got it electronically or not, but we'll dig it up, or maybe Rick can forward it back to Karis, and Karis can label it. Remember, it's just for discussion purposes only. It's Rick's work. It's not the committee's work, but it's a good thing to launch from, because he took some ideas that we were kicking around in our meeting and put them to paper and added his own insight. And so let's use that. Let's use that as our launch point. Does that make sense, Karis?
Karis, do you have my document, or do I need to send it to you?
I have it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll talk offline with Karis about other financial information that we want to put together in connection with our continuing discussion about the Emery Grover project. Okay. All right, so the next item on our agenda is the approve the minutes for our April 15th, 2020 meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to review them?
Yeah, and Peter, you had the one correction referencing both churches as opposed to just the one church.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a correction. I hope it was. As I said earlier, Zoom doesn't lie, but my intention was to say that we were going to have terms for both of the church projects. And so if we can insert that, a minor change.
I will insert it, but it was not said.
Pardon me?
I will insert it, but it might have been inferred, but not stated.
Oh, well, you know what? If it wasn't stated, we can, I don't want to, I don't, let's leave it as is, Kristen. Let's honor the record.
It was your intention.
Okay, it's my intention. Great. I love that. Okay, so add that. So it is that one of the goals was to have both First Baptist Church and First Parish applications and have a discussion regarding funding, what's fair and appropriate under our act. Okay, so it's a minor change. So with that amendment, a motion to approve the minutes of our April 13th, 2020 meeting. We need a motion.
So moved.
Okay, and a second? Chris?
Aye.
Okay, so Artie Crocker made the motion, seconded by Chris Gersel. We need to do roll call votes, I guess. I guess we do. Yep, we have to do a roll call vote. And here we go. I'm going to go in alphabetical order. Albert.
Yes, I was not present at that meeting, and so I abstain.
Okay, Albert abstains. Barnes.
Aye.
Crocker.
Aye.
Dermody.
Aye.
Dorfman.
Aye.
Gersel.
Aye.
Zambone.
Aye.
And Pingator, aye. Okay. And let's see. I do not have any other issues to discuss. And as far as whether or not I am here on June 17th, I would say stay tuned.
I have
Yes.
a quick question,
That was my
Peter, if I may.
Yes.
So I have a historical commission meeting at some point. I don't know when. How much am I free to share this information on Emery Grover with them? I know that they're, going to be interested in it. I don't know where they are with it because I haven't met with them we haven't had a meeting for a little bit. I just want to make sure I'm within the boundaries.
Well, first of all, this is a public meeting, and you're absolutely entitled to share anything and everything that was said here.
Okay.
And I am glad that you brought up the point that you are. I would welcome you reporting back to the committee because that's kind of that's an important part. This is a big expenditure for a historic artifact, and is the committee, is your institution really behind it, that they're ready to spend this kind of money for that building? And that's, how important of an artifact is it to this community? And you folks are the ones who are responsible for that. So I think a full report to them is a really important thing.
And may I share Karis's the agenda on that and the documentation on that with the 3 options? I don't know. They may have it. I just don't know.
Absolutely. You should share whatever you have. You should absolutely share that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
Peter, regarding your comment of stay tuned for the June 17th, you have not gotten any definitive word from the moderator?
actually, the moderator has informed me he's going to appoint me as the moderator, as the moderators.
Yay.
Yay.
Good news.
And I accepted, so he was going to prepare a document to send to Teddy Eaton. So yes, I think that's going to, yeah. I didn't know that he had already drafted it or not, but I'm sure it'll be done soon. So after the day after Election Day, I'm going to be the moderator's appointee to the committee.
Here, here.
So Peter, you and I are kindred spirits then.
In so many ways, Rick.
Get that down, person.
Okay. So yeah, I'm pretty excited actually. I really am. So
Wait.
committee, got some great, I mean, you guys, these folks are just great to work with. This is a really good committee, and we do some really important work, and we have some, you know, we have some difficult work ahead of us. And so we have a lot of responsibility. And so this is good work. And I'm glad that we all putting our heads in it and leaning into it. And that's good. I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with each and every one.
Great.
Great job.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
If there are any other matters that we need to discuss? All right. So we don't need do we have a motion to adjourn? I can't remember if we do that.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Second.
Oh, well.
All right, so hold on. We have to do this by roll call. So the motion to adjourn was done by Mr. Dermody. It was seconded by Mr. Gersel. I'll vote in order to honor our obligations under the Emergency Act. Paul Alpert,
Aye.
Barnes,
Aye.
Crocker,
Aye.
Dermody,
Yes.
Dorfman,
Yes.
Gersel,
Aye.
Zambone,
Aye.
and Pingator is aye. Thank you.